Welcome to Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Sit back, relax, let me tell you a story. Today's story is part 4 of The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mu, written by Tracy Thompson. In the ancient long noon of Earth, Mu lived in quiet harmony with the planet's living pulse, until the builders of Atlantis, guided by the mysterious architects, severed that current and set their great stone empire on the slow path to ruin. Let's get into it. Chapter 15. The first tremor was so gentle that most people ignored it. In Atlantis, a faint ripple moved through the stone floors of the eastern ring. A cup sitting beside a drafting table shifted a fraction of an inch and stopped. Engineers glanced down, waited a moment, then returned to their calculations. Small tremors were not unusual along the ridge. The city continued its work. Ships moved along the magnetized sea lanes. Water flowed through spiral canals that cut between towers of pale stone. Workers in the stone guild tuned a series of horns beside a quarry, preparing to move another massive block into place. But the ground trembled again. This time the vibration carried farther. It traveled through the magnetite rails, through the foundations of the towers, through the copper lattices buried deep beneath the streets. The quartz amplifiers responded immediately. Inside the great towers, the crystal cores flickered. The crystals had always amplified the Earth's natural vibration. That was their design. But now the signal arriving from the crust was no longer smooth. It came in irregular surges, sharp pulses followed by silence. Technicians inside the control chambers placed their hands against the crystal housings. The response felt wrong. "Reduce intake," one of them ordered quietly. Valves were adjusted. Energy draw from the laypath network decreased slightly. For a moment, the crystals stabilized. Then another surge arrived. Across the Atlantic plateau, horns began sounding as engineers attempted to stabilize the levitation grid used to move stone. The deep tones rolled across the landscape like distant thunder. A block lifted from the quarry floor, then it tilted. The workers stepped back quickly as the massive stone twisted sideways, the pressure field collapsing unevenly. The block dropped hard, cracking against the rock beneath it. Dust rose in a thick cloud. No one spoke for several seconds. This had never happened before. In the central council chamber, a runner entered quickly, carrying a thin crystal rod filled with recorded readings. He placed it on the table. Several of the older engineers leaned forward. One of them ran a hand across the surface of the rod, pulling the stored measurements directly into his nervous system. The data arrived in a rush of images, deep crust vibrations, shifting resonance lines, energy pressure building along the mid-Atlantic ridge. His eyes opened slowly. "The core is pushing back," he said. A quiet murmur moved through the chamber. Far away in the basin of Mu, the Lemurians felt the change differently. They stood in the warm mineral pools beneath a sky heavy with violet clouds. The water around their bodies pulsed with unusual strength, rising and falling in powerful waves that rolled through the basin like a deep breath. For centuries, the pulse had been faint. Now it was growing stronger. The elder who had spoken days earlier closed his eyes and let the current pass through his body. The sensation was unmistakable. The earth was responding. Not violently, not angrily, simply correcting. Across the ocean, the great grid built by Atlantis and guided by the architects was beginning to strain. Energy had been drawn upward for too long. The natural circulation between crust, ocean, and atmosphere had been forced into rigid channels. Pressure accumulated where flow once moved freely. And now the planet was redistributing the pressure. Along the ocean floor, long cracks began to stretch through the crust. Magma pushed slowly upward through old fault lines that had remained quiet for thousands of years. In Atlantis, the towers tried to stabilize the surge. Engineers adjusted frequencies. Crystal cores brightened as they attempted to compensate for the growing vibrations beneath the ridge. But each adjustment made the system more rigid. The planet was fluid. The machines were not. One of the younger engineers looked up from his console, eyes wide. If the ridge shifts, the older technician finished the thought. The grid breaks. Across the chamber, an architect stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city. The tall figure watched the towers flicker and the canal waters ripple in uneven patterns. Unlike the Atlanteans, the architect did not appear worried. If anything, there was curiosity in the narrow eyes. Experiments often produced unexpected results. That was part of the process. Outside, the sea had begun to move differently. Long swells rolled toward the coastline even though no storm was visible on the horizon. Water levels in the outer canals rose slightly, then fell again as another tremor passed through the ground. Ships anchored in the harbor rocked gently against their moorings. Far beneath them, along the spine of the Atlantic ridge, enormous plates of crust were slowly beginning to shift. The movement was not fast. It was patient. The kind of motion that builds quietly until it cannot be held back any longer. Back in Mu, the elder opened his eyes and looked toward the distant horizon.
The earth is breathing again,
he said. Around him, the other Lemurians felt it too. The pulse had returned. But it was no longer the calm rhythm of the long noon. It was the deep inhale before a powerful exhale. And when the earth released that breath, the cities of stone and crystal built along its surface would discover just how little control they truly possessed. The correction had begun. Chapter 16. The next tremor was not gentle. It began far beneath the ocean floor, where the long ridge of Atlantis stretched like a spine through the Atlantic basin. For centuries, the crust there had held steady while the cities above it drew energy through carefully aligned channels of stone and magnetite. Now the pressure was returning. Deep fractures widened slowly in the rock. Magma pushed upward in slow, heavy currents searching for release. The energy that had once moved freely through the natural circuits of the planet now met resistance everywhere it tried to flow. Something had to give. In Atlantis, the towers were first to react. The quartz cores inside the amplifiers brightened suddenly, their clear surfaces filled with streaks of white light as the crystals attempted to stabilize the surge of energy moving through the grid. Technicians rushed through the control chambers. Readings poured across crystal panels. Vibrations climbed beyond anything recorded in the archives. The instruments that measured resonance began to hum continuously, unable to separate one signal from another. One engineer placed both hands against the housing of the nearest crystal. The information rushed through him. Pressure lines along the ridge, energy rebounding through the grid network, fractures opening deep beneath the crust. He pulled his hands away quickly.
It's rising,
he said. Across the chamber, another technician looked up. How far? The engineer hesitated.
everywhere.
Outside the tower, the city had begun to notice. Water in the canals moved in uneven waves, slapping softly against the stone edges. The crystal bridges that spanned the rings of the city vibrated faintly under the feet of those crossing them. Some people paused and looked down at the water. Others looked toward the towers. The air carried a strange tension now, like the feeling before a storm. Along the outer construction paths, workers had stopped trying to lift stone. The horns lay silent beside the rails. No one trusted the ground enough to float a block weighing 50 tons above their heads. Instead, they watched the horizon. The sea had changed color. Where the water usually reflected the violet glow of the thick atmosphere, it now carried darker streaks moving slowly across the surface. Warm currents from deep vents were rising faster than usual. One of the harbor pilots stood beside his vessel and squinted toward the distant line of the ocean. "The water is boiling somewhere," he muttered. Back in the council halls, the arguments had grown louder. Guild leaders stood around a long stone table covered with resonance charts. The numbers were climbing faster with every new reading. Stone Guild representatives demanded immediate shutdown of several towers. The Energy Guild refused.
"If we release the grid suddenly," one of them argued, "the rebound will be worse."
Across the table, another voice answered sharply.
"And if we hold it?"
No one responded immediately. At the far end of the chamber, 3 architects stood quietly together. They had not spoken during the entire discussion. Their tall forms remained perfectly still, while the Atlanteans argued over the failing system. One of the engineers finally turned toward them.
"You designed part of this network," he said. "What do you recommend?"
For a moment, the chamber fell completely silent. One of the architects stepped forward. The figure's eyes reflected the light from the crystal lamps above the table.
"The grid must remain active," the architect said calmly.
A few of the Atlanteans frowned.
"Why?"
someone asked. The architect tilted its head slightly, as if considering how much explanation was necessary.
"The energy redistribution is incomplete."
The words hung in the air.
"Incomplete?"
the engineer repeated. The architect nodded once.
"The system has not yet reached equilibrium."
Several people in the chamber exchanged uneasy looks. Equilibrium was exactly what they feared was failing. Outside, another tremor rolled through the city. This one was strong enough to send small waves splashing across the edges of the canals. A few stone fragments dropped from the edge of a nearby tower and clattered onto the street below. People stepped back, staring upward. Far beneath the ridge, the fractures continued to widen. Massive plates of crust were grinding slowly against one another, releasing centuries of trapped pressure. Heat from the mantle surged upward through the cracks, heating the ocean water above them. Along the sea floor, entire fields of hydrothermal vents erupted with new force. Columns of mineral-rich water blasted upward into the dark ocean. In the basin of Mu, the Lemurians felt the pulse change again. The mineral pools where they stood trembled gently, sending rings of warm water outward across the surface. The sensation moving through their bodies was unmistakable. The planet was preparing to release something enormous. The elder looked toward the distant horizon where the ocean met the sky.
"They pushed the currents too far," he said quietly.
Around him, the others felt the truth in those words. The pulse of the earth had always moved in cycles of expansion and contraction for hundreds of thousands of years. Mu had lived inside that rhythm. Atlantis had tried to control it. Now the cycle was correcting itself. Across the ocean, the towers of Atlantis still glowed against the darkening sky, but beneath their foundations, the fracture line was widening. And when it finally broke open, the grid that held the civilization together would snap like a thread pulled too tight. The world was very close to that moment. Chapter 17. The rupture began in the dark, nearly 4 miles below the surface of the Atlantic, where sunlight had never reached. The crust of the planet strained against the pressure building beneath it. For centuries, the stone there had held its shape. The energy that once flowed naturally through the ridge had been redirected into the great Atlantean grid above. Towers, crystals, and magnetized paths had drawn that energy upward and held it in carefully tuned circuits. But the earth was not designed to hold still. The first crack opened slowly. A thin fracture spread through the basalt like a line drawn across glass. Superheated water forced its way into the gap, instantly flashing to steam as it met the rising heat from below. The crack widened. Then the ridge moved. The sound would have been deafening if anyone had been close enough to hear it. Rock split apart with a deep grinding roar as 2 massive plates of crust shifted against one another. Molten stone surged upward through the opening. The ocean above responded immediately. Columns of boiling water exploded upward from the seafloor vents. Entire fields of mineral plumes rose into the darkness, carrying clouds of black sediment that spread outward like underwater storms. The pressure wave traveled quickly. By the time it reached the surface, the sea above Atlantis had already begun to change. Ships in the outer harbor lifted and fell sharply as the water beneath them surged upward. The calm rhythm of the waves vanished. New swells rolled across the surface from no visible direction. Harbor pilots grabbed the railings of their vessels as the water rose beneath them in slow, heavy pulses. One of them looked toward the distant towers.
"That ridge just moved,"
he said. Inside the city, the towers reacted before the people did. The crystal cores flared bright white. Energy surged through the grid lines beneath the streets as the system attempted to absorb the shock traveling through the crust. The amplifiers hummed so loudly that the sound echoed through the chambers that housed them. Technicians covered their ears. The readings on the crystal panels climbed beyond the upper limits of their scales. One engineer stared at the numbers, his voice quiet.
"The ridge is opening."
Across the room, another technician shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "It's tearing." The next tremor struck harder. Stone floors rippled beneath the feet of the workers. Several of the crystal housings rang like bells as the vibration passed through them. Fine cracks appeared along the edges of the chamber walls. Outside, the people of Atlantis finally understood something was wrong. The canals that wound through the city surged suddenly, sending water spilling over their stone edges. The crystal bridges vibrated beneath the feet of those crossing them. A woman carrying a basket of tools stopped in the middle of the walkway and gripped the railing. The entire bridge shuddered once, then again. Children playing along the canal banks stopped and looked toward the towers, where the glow from the crystals had grown almost painfully bright. Across the city, horns began to sound. These were not the horns used for lifting stone. These were the deep, warning horns mounted along the central ring. Their low tone rolled through the streets like distant thunder. People began moving toward the open plazas between the towers. Some carried tools. Others carried nothing at all. They were not running yet. But the calm certainty that had filled Atlantis for generations was beginning to crack. Inside the council chamber, the arguments had stopped completely. All eyes were fixed on the newest readings arriving through the crystal rods. The line showing crust movement had jumped sharply. An engineer ran his hands across the data surface, pulling the information into his nervous system. His face paled. "The ridge split 20 miles south," he said quietly. A murmur spread around the table. "How wide?" someone asked. The engineer hesitated. "Still opening." Across the chamber, the architects stood watching. They showed no fear. One of them stepped forward and studied the resonance charts. "The system must remain active," the architect repeated. The Atlantean engineers turned toward the figure. One of them spoke carefully. "If the ridge continues to open, the energy surge will travel through the grid." The architects nodded once. "Yes." "And the towers?" "They will adapt." The room fell silent. Everyone present knew the limits of the towers. They were powerful, but they were not built to absorb the force of the shifting tectonic plate. Far across the ocean, in the basin of Mu, the Lemurians felt the rupture pass through the pulse of the earth. The mineral pools trembled beneath their feet. Rings of warm water spread across the surface, moving outward again and again as a deep vibration rolled through the basin. The elder closed his eyes. For a long moment, he simply stood there, letting the sensation move through him. Then he opened them again. "It has begun," he said. Around him, the others listened quietly. None of them spoke. Across the horizon, far beyond the violet haze of the thick atmosphere, the Atlantean towers were still glowing against the darkening sky. But the ridge beneath them had begun to break apart. And once the crust opened fully, no crystal tower or engineered grid would be strong enough to hold the planet still. The Earth was moving again, and Atlantis stood directly above the fault. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining me for Echoes of My Imagination. My name is Tracy Lee. Don't forget to subscribe, share, follow, and like, and join me next time for part 5 of The Lost Currents of Atlantis and Mu.